Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for this latest Rootwurks webinar. What will Schedule 3 mean for the cannabis industry? My name is Ben Hartman. I'm the content manager here at Rootwurks, and I'll be your host for this webinar today. So as you probably saw last week, the Associated Press broke the news that the Drug Enforcement Administration will officially reclassify cannabis to Schedule 3. News that had a lot of people in the industry quite happy, had things a buzz, a lot of articles written about it. Some people weren't too happy, but by and large, it's being seen as one of the biggest stories in legalization in recent years and should have a really big effect on the industry. But to make sense of it all and actually explain what it'll mean for the industry and for cannabis consumers, we have an expert here today. So we got with us Andrew Livingston, the Director of Economics and Research at the cannabis law firm Vicente LLP's Denver office, where he assists clients with developing and expanding their enterprises across cannabis markets nationally, internationally. He's also been involved in studying and working in cannabis markets for a while now, well over a decade, including back on the campaign for Amendment 64 in Colorado, which is a big part of how we got to where we are today with the industry. So definitely somebody who's been involved for a long time and knows this stuff. And thanks for being here, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. It's great to chat with you. It's always good to talk with the Rootwurks community and be on another webinar. I think this will be my second on rescheduling. So, we do a little bit before and after. And we'll do a third once, it actually becomes effective. And we'll talk about when that might occur.
Yeah, the third could be like the fallout, but I imagine it'll be actually, it'll be positive. But yeah, there would be
all in, I guess. Yeah.
That was when we were first kind of talking about it last year, that it looked like there's a good chance they're going to do it, and now it looks like it's kind of a matter of when. But it's still really interesting and exciting, and I think a lot of people still kind of don't understand what it'll actually mean. So what, I guess, just real quick, if somebody were to ask you what are the different scheduling levels, why is it referred to as scheduling? Like what are they?
Yeah. So the different schedule levels are determined by the FDA and the DEA, and it generally applies to the restrictiveness of pharmaceutical drugs and of drugs in general. Obviously there are drugs that are not Schedule 1 or may not end up being Schedule 1 that are not FDA approved medicines. For instance, like cannabis is hopefully going to be moving from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, but it's not like that means you automatically get to buy marijuana flower, or really any marijuana drug from a pharmacy. It not only has to go through lower scheduling, but it also has to become then an FDA approved drug, in the way that Epidiolex was an FDA approved drug for the treatment of epilepsy disorders, and that was approved a few years ago. It's only a few different cannabis drugs that are FDA approved. And so what this generally means, now, how much will it affect criminal penalties? Not really much. Now, there are some states that tie the degree of criminal penalties to the different drug scheduling, but most of the time that's specific to the drug. So for instance, like, crimes associated with cannabis and cannabis trafficking are specific to cannabis. It doesn't matter whether or not that's Schedule 1 or Schedule 3. Furthermore, it's often more associated with the weight, right? It's like, how much volume of this drug are you holding, are you possessing, are you trafficking? And that has to do with the criminal penalties there. There are some difference predominantly for research, as well as for kind of how pharmacies have to hold certain medicines, greater restrictions for, Schedule 2 and 3 drugs than there are for Schedule 4 and 5 drugs. But the difference is a lot more nuanced than what would apply to most people, who are listening to the webinar. If you're a pharmacist, you kind of already know how some of these things play out. But, generally, the way that, we think about scheduling is Schedule 1 drugs, as determined by the FDA and DEA, have a high potential abuse and no currently accepted medical use. Schedule 2 through 5 drugs do have a currently accepted medical use. And, whether or not they're in Schedule 2 or they're in Schedule 4 or 5 has to do with essentially the risk and abuse potential.
Right. I think that was an interesting point, because I think it was kind of surprising to some people that there's actually some drugs that are considered hard drugs, or harder drugs, certainly, than cannabis, aren't actually are like scheduled lower. Like I think PCP, if I'm not mistaken, is Schedule 2. Some other more like
cocaine,
for instance,
is in a Schedule 1. Yeah, and that's because they have a perceived medical use.
Right.
They have a currently accepted medical use. So it's important to remember that the drugs that are in Schedule 1, many of them that are there and have been there since the 1970s, it is not a medical determination, it is a socio-political determination, right? So most of your hallucinogens are all in Schedule 1, marijuana is in Schedule 1. It's because they're countercultural drugs that occurred when, MDMA is in Schedule 1, right? Some of these things are going to change because we are creating medicines around them, right? There's currently phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials for, MDMA for PTSD that Lykos and, psilocybin is going through things with Compass. So it's like there's clear medical use of these other drugs as well. It is just a political determination for, hippies use these drugs and we need to make sure that the hippies go to jail. And so that's kind of where a lot of this stuff originated from in the 1970s when the drug war and scheduling was determined. And then furthermore, some of this kind of got, it got ingrained in our society, and it also importantly got ingrained into international treaties with the, 1961 single convention, the UN Single Convention on Narcotics, and then the 1971 Psychotropic Substances Act, and some other international treaties that, kind of further solidified the drug war internationally. That is actually a bigger issue than we all think with regards to rescheduling here in the United States, since the DEA, one of their primary concerns and one of the things that they are tasked with is adherence to that 1961 Single Convention. And they, for a long time, have made the argument that in order for them to be compliant, medical cannabis needs to be in Schedule 1. It's not true, but it's also important to recognize that the DEA is filled with drug warriors. They just hate cannabis. They're institutionally opposed to anything that would shift the sociocultural drugs, cannabis, psilocybin, kind of your hallucinogens and stuff like that, into a more normalized situation, because that was kind of their raison d'etre, right? They got started because they were national and international drug cops.
Yeah, and I think something that runs through all this is the extent to which, like a thread through all this, that it's not necessarily a science-based thing here, or science or a biological sort of thing. It's politics and ideology and
and one of the major things, right? So, I talked about the schedules, right? There's both currently accepted medical use, and then there's also, risks and abuse. So for a long time, the DEA had put forward a criteria for what is currently accepted medical use, which pretty much mirrored the requirements to get that drug to become an FDA-approved pharmaceutical. So cannabis was never able to go through that process because FDA doesn't approve generally like big phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials on smoked flower, right? Like we don't have any smoked drugs. We don't really, now that I think about it, I don't even think we have any vaporized drugs, right? Everything that's inhaled is like a nebulizer.
Right.
And there's very few inhaled drugs.
Something that requires combustion?
Generally. And so further than that, I don't know of any drugs, any FDA approved drugs that require you heat them and inhale them into your lungs. That's just also because it's like not a healthy way of absorbing drugs.
Right.
Your lungs don't like hot smoke in them. I do because I like smoking weed, but the FDA doesn't. So there's also not necessarily the money that pharmaceutical companies are looking to put forward. And so because of that, we were never able to get cannabis rescheduled until Health and Human Services essentially decided to come out with a different criteria, a criteria that I and a handful of experts who are very knowledgeable on this, Shane Pennington and others, basically were saying, hey, you need to have a different criteria for what is currently accepted medical use than the criteria you would utilize for a prescription drug to become FDA approved. And so they have they put out a different criteria, a 2-part criteria rather than a previously 5-part criteria that basically just looks at like, are there studies that show that there is specific use for this? And they also importantly included data from state medical marijuana programs. So that really helped to lay the groundwork for what that looks like. So all of that is actually really important as it comes to this rescheduling process, because one of the things the industry and the cannabis reform movement is going to need to spend a lot of time and resources on, and that we're currently working on, but there'll be calls to action over the next few months, is helping to support this public comment period so that we can defend Health and Human Services determination of currently accepted medical use and appropriate safety. Because while the DEA, it seems like that they signed off on this. I saw some reports earlier in the week that the head of the DEA didn't necessarily sign off. Maybe it was an underling. And the DEA, it seems pretty clear that they got pulled kicking and screaming into approving this.
Yeah, it didn't seem
and so they're going to want to defeat it administratively, even though they signed off.
Yeah. Well, they have an interesting question about pharmaceutical stuff here that a viewer sent in, but I just want to real quick about an earlier point that you made. Schedule 3 is not going to supersede the criminal law, right? Like, so in other words, if you were to be arrested for a possession charge last week, if cannabis is Schedule 3 next week and you're caught in possession in a violation of state law, it'll still be illegal.
Yeah. So
right?
Even next week, even once this passes, Schedule 3, that doesn't automatically change criminal laws in states that doesn't exist, right? So if you're in Idaho, it doesn't matter whether or not, if you're caught smoking weed and it's Schedule 1, or you're caught smoking weed and it's Schedule 3, you're still going to be a crime. And it's also because, Schedule 3 just means that there is a currently accepted medical use. State markets are still going to be operating outside the bounds of law, right? Because they're not operating in compliance with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, the FDCA. And the FDCA is what, basically outlines how to legally comply federally. So there's not really going to be a difference. There's to some degree there's a difference, but as far as your, legal standing, the primary laws that people were violating federally are essentially violations of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. That applies whether you're Schedule 1 or that applies whether you're Schedule 3. There's, when you're Schedule 1, there's not a way to get that approved, right? By and large. But with Schedule 3, right, the only way to be federally approved and fully legal federally is to, A, be one of the DA licensed cultivation facilities, or a, FDA, DA approved researcher who has authorization to work with study drug for clinical studies, or to get a drug approved as a FDA approved pharmaceutical. So that's really kind of your pathways there. In order for cannabis to be fully legal in the way that most of us consume it, we need to have full federal legalization into criminalization.
Yeah, I think that's one thing for people to remember. Like, even when it gets reclassified, you can still get arrested for that same thing. And so don't go out and, don't go celebrating in the streets with a brick of weed or anything. Not yet. So we had a question come in here about kind of the pharmaceutical aspect of things. I think it relates to what you were saying a few minutes ago. So is the pharmaceutical industry going to make a play to control the market? And how would that impact current recreational dispensaries when it comes to licensing? Will we need some sort of pharmaceutical license? I guess, does that status mean it's now you're selling a recognized, federally recognized form of medicine or something like that? Or is it?
Yeah, so I personally don't think the pharmaceutical industry is going to make a major play to control the market. They could have done that over the last few years. So, one of the big things that, the pharmaceutical industry isn't going for it because you can't patent cannabis. Well, that's, it's been essentially utilized for so long. One of the things we have learned, and I recommend people listen to Rick Doblin on this, right? Because MDMA itself couldn't be patented either, but Lycos, their public benefit corp, is moving forward on that because there is a period of data exclusivity that you have for the medicalization of that drug for a certain amount of time. And so, you could have that generally. Now, the main reason that pharmaceutical industry isn't trying to control the market is because the FDA, in my mind, I don't think is ever going to approve, as I mentioned previously, a heated and inhaled drug. And that is how cannabis, more than half of cannabis is used, right? Both flower, pre-rolls, concentrates, vape pens, right? And so then the question is, okay, is there enough of a market for topical and edible products, right? Let's say a tincture or some other form. I think that there could be a large market for that, for specific ailments, say, certain topical issues in which, the topical market in regulated storefronts at the state level isn't very big. It's usually less than 1% of a market.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, the pharmaceutical companies are looking at this and going like, okay, right now, maybe I would pursue something with regards to, creating a specific cannabinoid, not derived in the plant, or maybe it's derived in the plant and extracted and formulated in a certain way. And, we'll use that for certain conditions. But we haven't really seen a lot of action there. There's Jazz Pharmaceuticals who, bought out, previous GW Pharma, which has both Epidiolex approved in the United States, as well as Sativex, which is more of a full THC for spasticity, and that's utilized internationally, but that's not huge either. So I personally don't think the pharmaceutical industry is going to make a play to control the market, right? They could have put pressure on the FDA to go after existing state regulated cannabis businesses. The FDA just hasn't done that, and when they have, it's really going out on the margins for things like unapproved medical claims. Now, when we talk about how this impacts recreational dispensaries when licensing, you're going to continue to operate under state law outside of the bounds of federal law. Getting a pharmacist license is not going to protect you because you'd still be selling unapproved drugs. And if anything, one of the things we saw was that the FDA sent some warning letters to Georgia, which was trying to essentially implement a program in which independent pharmacies could sell medical cannabis. That's not lawful under the federal federal law, and so the FDA sent some warning letters out to those independent pharmacies and say, hey, you'd be in violation of doing all this stuff. And it's important, it's like pharmacy license is a state and federal license, and so you put that in jeopardy too. You're just going to keep operating the way you've been operating. The main thing that will change, which we'll talk about in a minute, is 280E.
Right. I think, I guess also just kind of goes without saying the pharmaceutical industry knows how to make money, and there's a lot of drugs that they already know how to make plenty of money off of. I think they got plenty, like they don't, and certainly ones that are, I imagine,
industry that exists. If there was a way for them to overtake the medical cannabis market, they would have done that over the last 10 years.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure there's easier ones and easier things. And if there was, sure they've thought of this too. So what about something, you mentioned 280, I guess, we jump into that because that's something that I think after the news came out early last week, that was one of the things that was at the center of all these different articles. All things aside, everything else aside, just 280E alone is a big deal for us. So what is 280E? And why is it a big deal?
280E is a section of the 280E was a section of the tax code, which was put in after. So this was, was it put in 1970 at the time that marijuana was first Schedule 1? It was put in at a later date in 1982. And that was done because essentially a drug dealer wrote off a bunch of stuff on his taxes because he was able to. And the federal government got pissed at that and then included a provision in one of the tax codes that was passed during the Reagan era for basically not allowing certain deductions.
But good for him, though. That's real initiative. I like that.
Yeah. If you're going to be an unlawful, drug trafficker, have a good accountant.
Definitely.
So, and I'm going to read it exact because it's only about 4.5 lines. So it says no deductions. This is 26 U.S. Code 280E, expenditures in connection with illegal sales of drugs. It says no deduction or credit shall be allowed for any amount paid or incurred during the taxable year in carrying on any trade or business if such trade or business, in parentheses, or the activities which comprise such trade or business consists of trafficking in a controlled substance, in parentheses, within the meaning of Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 of the Controlled Substances Act, which is prohibited by federal law or the law of any state in which such trade or business is conducted. So the real important thing there, right, it says consists of trafficking in controlled substances, in parentheses, within the meaning of Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 of the Controlled Substances Act. So what that means is that if cannabis is not Schedule 1 or Schedule 2, it no longer applies, even if that activity is unlawful, right?
If it's still federally illegal.
Cannabis companies will still be violating the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act because they will be selling an unapproved Schedule 3 drug, but they will not be subject to 280E if that drug is Schedule 3. Now, why was it only applied to Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 drugs? I would need to look into the history of that. I'm not 100% sure. But it is just a weird quirk that is why 280E is going to change, right? And what that means is, so no deductions or credits, that applies to all of your selling, general, administrative expenses. So in a profit and loss sheet, right, you've got your revenue, you've got your cost of goods sold. The cost of goods sold is the cost it takes to produce the product. Or if you're a retailer, the cost of acquiring that wholesale product. And then selling, general, administrative expenses are the costs associated with selling and marketing that product. That's what you can't deduct. And so that was essentially getting double taxed. Cannabis companies, rather than being taxed on their profits, were being taxed on their gross margin. Now, why you were able to deduct cost of goods sold without SG&A has to do with the definition of income. And income was basically your gross margin, not your revenue.
What does it affect, like, for the average business? Like, what is I guess, like, the bottom line? Is that like in terms of savings per year, let's say it's like 10%?
Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars.
So real money.
A lot. It's a lot. Now, some of it depends upon how aggressive you were previously, right? Your degree of savings, it depends upon the tax position you're at. Now, some big companies took pretty aggressive tax stances. And so this will shore them up on their legal footing, but it may not save them as much money because they were taking an aggressive position previously. And with all of this, consult your accountant. I'm not an accountant.
Right. But I mean, this is one of those things, like 280E and the tax aspect of it is one of those things with the cannabis industry that's been sort of, I would say, like, unfair is the right word, but it's one of those things, like, there's certain factors that the industry deals with that other industries don't.
Oh, it's grossly unfair.
And that's,
Yeah, grossly unfair. I mean, so, why is the cannabis industry struggling? We ask ourselves that, right? So, the state level regulatory requirements create significant burdens on operational costs. So your operational costs are challenging.
Right.
Some of these markets are highly competitive. And so your wholesale and retail prices face a lot of competitive pressures. All of your, if you have debt, your interest rate on that debt is often much higher, right, because bank lending, by and large, is very limited or doesn't occur. And so, your supply of potential investors is lower, so your lending is higher. Also, because you can't really collateralize those loans utilizing your cannabis assets as easily as you can for other markets, because you have to have a license in order to own a cultivation facility, right? So you can't just have someone take it. And so that's there are issues there. And then also 280E makes the cannabis companies not all that profitable. Right. So there's a variety of different factors that have resulted in cannabis companies just struggling economically. And so this rescheduling move, while it still keeps cannabis illegal federally, right, it doesn't change the legal status of the cannabis companies state licensed in Colorado and operating in Colorado. They're still violating federal law. They're maybe violating less federal laws, but they're still in violation of federal law. But the main thing that it affects for state level cannabis businesses is 280E. Now, there's other benefits societally, right? Hopefully this will spur some more research. This is an indication that the federal government is recognizing the reality that cannabis is a medicine. So that's really huge. But by and large for cannabis companies, the main thing it affects is 280E.
Yeah, and that's one of those ways that it's sort of the deck has been stacked against them from, no matter how you operate, no matter how you run your company, that's just baked into it. Yeah. This factor that's just really difficult to get over or get past. So you mentioned research. How will this affect cannabis research?
So, that's a big question. Now, there was a law passed, I think it was in 2002. I'd have to, that's a cannabis research bill that actually, and again, I would here recommend that people read Matt Zorn and Shane Pennington's Substack on drugs on this. Mm-hmm. Shane Pennington, who used to work at the firm, now works at a different firm, is one of the top experts in this. And he rails quite a bit against one of these laws that actually was passed and signed into law a few years ago, we're dealing with medical cannabis research, that it kind of enshrines some of the difficulties of research into law specifically to cannabis, not associated with its schedule. So that was a problem, and hopefully will need to be corrected. Now, if we ask ourselves, okay, is this going to affect the stigma associated with cannabis research, and that cannabis research being approved by institution, universities and things like that? I think it will. So it hopefully should spur some more research, but I'm not exactly sure how much more will actually occur, right? If we're talking about like major big studies, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, right now, MAPS is trying to put forward a phase 2, I think it's a phase 2 clinical trial on smoked cannabis for I don't even think it's smoked, it's vaporized cannabis for PTSD. That's been running into issues. So that's one of the ones I'm pretty sure they were working with Sue Sisley on, and Michigan was trying to push forward on. There's a few articles on that, and that's kind of being stalled because the FDA doesn't want to approve a heated vaporized or heated smoked drug in a large clinical trials. I don't think that will change with it being rescheduled. So how much more research will occur? There's a ton of research that occurs on cannabis, right? Right now for rescheduling, we're going through a lot of these studies, but a lot of them are, either observational studies or they're systematic reviews or meta studies of other studies. There's not as many large scale clinical trials, again, because it's hard. I mean, it's hard to double blind cannabis. It's possible, but it's hard to double blind cannabis. It's hard to get approved large trials of smoked drug through the FDA.
Which makes sense. But I imagine that as a recognized or as having a recognized medical usage, that would mean that in theory it would be easier to get funding or some, recognition.
Hopefully. Yeah. I don't really know, right? Yeah. It's like, how much of this is a change in how the FDA will approach approving clinical studies for cannabis, or how much of this is entirely just like a political shift, right? It's hard to really know. I think in the FDA, there's a pretty significant cultural shift around cannabis over the last, decade. Less so in the DEA. There has been in the DEA too, but less so. They're more focused on fentanyl and opioids, but they're not any fan of cannabis.
Right. And I think probably unwise to expect the DEA to be at the forefront of the culture, when it comes to, but yeah, certainly. I mean, they're not going to be towards the front of the pack on that by any means.
Yeah.
And I also just wanted to second that about the Substack on drugs. I was reading it last year when the Schedule 3 news was first coming out. They had a lot of, I think they published the Department of Health and Human Services letter, or if I'm not mistaken, their study.
Yeah, Matt Zorn was the one who got that.
That's great.
Got that to become public.
That's very good.
Yeah, if you're, I'm not sure if Shane. I don't think Shane works on the Substack anymore. But Matt is also, these guys are really the top experts on this. So if you're looking for something that is super in depth, but also written in a form that is accessible, and in some cases profane, they're the best on it.
Yeah, it was fun. It was very informative. I also like and the title is great, On Drugs. Almost a, it says what it is, and it almost sounds like a literary journal too, On Drugs. But it's so definitely we endorse that one.
Yeah.
So how is this? What sort of initial impact we've seen from a business standpoint, like cannabis stocks? Have they kind of had?
Yeah, there's a big bump. I was looking at this yesterday. There's a big bump. It seems as though for a lot of the publicly traded cannabis companies, there's like a 20% bump in their stock price, but then it fell a day or two later. I mean, it's just day trading potentially.
Yeah.
How this will affect them really, again, depends upon the degree of aggressiveness they were taking with their tax position previously, right? If you're already taking a pretty aggressive tax position, your relative difference isn't going to be as much, but your risk of having to pay back taxes may lessen a little bit if you're determined that your position you were taking was too aggressive.
But does it, will it make it easier for companies to get funding? In other words, like people who want to invest in cannabis, maybe now it seems like a safer industry to invest in, a safer place to put your money.
Yeah, so I think it will absolutely impact. There will be more investment, and there's two reasons why I think there'll be more investment. One, it's another indication by the federal government that we are lessening our approach to cannabis enforcement, and that cannabis is becoming more normalized, and so the perceived legal risk for investors have dropped, because and probably the actual risk of enforcement is also dropping to some degree with Schedule 3. But I think the main reason why I think investment will increase into the cannabis companies nationally. Now, let's again differentiate between the large multi-state publicly traded companies and your average cannabis company, right? I think your average cannabis company wasn't taking as aggressive as a tax position as your large multi-state operators, because large multi-state operators have more money to pay, tax counsel and CPAs.
Right.
But for the average cannabis company, you're going to have significant benefits to their cash flow, because 280E is no longer double taxing a lot of their expenditures. And so with a better cash position for cannabis companies, that's going to mean that investors are going to be more likely to be able to be paid back. And so I think there's going to be a lot more investment, hopefully on better terms as well, as the financial risk, not just the legal risk, the financial risk of investing in a cannabis company diminishes. It's still a risky investment. It's not like this is, stocks and bonds. This is a highly competitive, complex business that is not federally illegal. But your cash flow position for the cannabis companies is going to be better because 280E is removed. So that should help to spur some investment.
Mm-hmm. So you think that is it too simple to say? Does that mean like we're going to see better days ahead for the industry, or?
I think there will be better days ahead of the industry. Like, it's also that we were in a lurch over the last, year or two, right? So if anything, we need some optimism. This is optimism that will actually impact cannabis companies to the benefit, right? If it wasn't for 280E, the impact on cannabis companies would exist, but not be huge. In my mind, this is, a great move. Another interesting thing that I think we should think about is, in my mind, 280E was essential to deal with before federal legalization, because now any future federal legalization doesn't have to have such a high tax as to overcome the loss occurred from 280E, right? Because if we think about it, 280E going away is a multi-million-dollar loss for the federal government.
Or billion, I mean, even
right, because they were essentially getting more taxes than they deserved, right? And so, if the Congressional Budget Office were to just score a cannabis law, right, it would, in many cases, early on, have a negative taxes, right? Because cannabis companies would be paying less to the federal government, because it would, when you would federally legalize, that would have also, changed 280E. They wouldn't be subject to 280E anymore. And so a lot of these federal tax proposals, these federal legalization proposals, had very high taxes, because they wanted to not only make up for the loss of 280E, but also raise money after that. But making up for the loss of 280E was always, in my mind, in a moral position, because 280E was wrong to begin with, right? There was no reason cannabis companies should be paying these exorbitant taxes. So getting rid of it administratively means that we can have a more sensible tax discussion when it comes to future federal legalization.
I see. And I think you hit upon this before, but in terms of like a regulatory issues, I mean, cannabis markets are still going to be regulated by the states, just like they were before. That's not going to change what you have to do. Compliance.
That's still going to be likely the case when federal legalization passes, right? There's going to be some sort of degree of federal framework. But when we think about it with alcohol, right, there's vastly different regulations state by state for alcohol sales.
Yeah, you can vary from county to county even. But yeah, definitely. So in other words, it's not, once it goes into Schedule 3, you're not going to have all new set of compliance guidelines you deal with or whatever.
No, not with Schedule 3, because again, you're not in compliance with federal law, right? You're not in compliance with the FDCA. And so some things might change, but we'll have to really see on the edges where those operational things shift. I mean, it will likely also spur states to potentially, revisit certain of their requirements and hopefully reduce some of the most onerous operational requirements.
Yeah, and I think it could be also the sort of thing is like once you remove one hindrance on an industry, one hindrance, it can tend to lead to other ones. The sky didn't fall when we changed that, so maybe it won't when we change this or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, I guess before we get out of here, I want to ask: do you think this means that legalization would be more likely to happen in the next, the near future, or less? Is it sort of like, can they now come with the approach of, they got Schedule 3, there's no impetus really to do something. Now we already did something, just be happy with that? Or...
This is a difficult question to answer, right? In one end, this is the federal government recognizing that marijuana has medical use. And I think for some people on the edges who didn't have a hard stance on cannabis, which is hard to imagine, most people do, this may be like, well, we're recognizing the medical benefits of cannabis, and it's not as dangerous from an abuse potential as the DAO said it was. So I think there's that. But in my mind, getting federal cannabis legal legislation passed is going to be challenging, given the fact that our federal government doesn't operate all that efficiently at getting large pieces of substantive legislation passed on controversial issues. So I don't know whether or not this will increase or decrease the pace of federal legalization. Mm-hmm. It will, right? One of the main reasons that cannabis companies were pushing for federal legalization was 280E, but cannabis companies still want to be able to, uplist. The big cannabis companies want to be able to uplist onto the New York Stock Exchange from, Canadian stock exchanges. They want to be able to, transport cannabis across state lines. They want to be able to get bank loans and lines of credit from, large institutions. They want to be able to be, recognized federally. So, there's still the reasons for full legalization. Those people that were saying, oh, well, if you reschedule, that means that no cannabis company is going to want to push for legalization. I don't think that's true. There's still going to be the reasons, a lot of big, both financial and social reasons to push for full legalization. Mm-hmm. So, what happens, right? Like, even when we had a Democratic trifecta, we couldn't get legalization passed. I don't think there are 60 votes in the Senate for a full legalization, even if we were to get somehow, more than 50 Democrats, or more than 60 Democratic senators. Not all of them are in favor of legalization. Right. So what does the timeline look like? I'm confident that cannabis is going to be legalized, but I don't know if it's going to be in the next 5 years, 10 years, or 15.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's like that saying, what do you think of the French Revolution? Well, it's too early to say. So maybe it's just we need to wait a little bit. But is that kind of what the opposition is here? Where some people are a little bit more cautious about Schedule 3? Is it just because it doesn't go far enough?
I think so there's opposition both from just prohibitionists who are just like, hey, I don't like any incremental reform on cannabis, or on cannabis, and I think cannabis is bad. And so Project SAM, although they've been talking about, oh, we're not opposed to medical cannabis, they are driving the opposition as it comes to the administrative process for rescheduling, and that's a very important process. It's going to pan out over the next year or so. The other opposition are from kind of, we can say the left. I don't know if it's really the left, which are people saying that this isn't far enough and it only helps, cannabis business. It doesn't get anyone out of jail. Right. Well, first and foremost, I would say the most important thing to get people out of jail is to pass legalization at the state level, as most people in jail for cannabis are arrested at the state level and not the federal level. Mm-hmm. And two, one of them, I would say it is very helpful to get federal legalization passed when we have the Health and Human Services on the record saying that marijuana, has medical benefits and is not as risky as we thought. That's a benefit. That's for sure. We are essentially utilizing government statements to make federal legalization easier, and so I think, in some way that that is beneficial. It's not like cannabis companies will stop pushing for legalization, or it's not like the reform movement is going to stop pushing for legalization now that they have 280E reform.
Yeah, I don't see people stopping. I don't see that until the.
I mean, if anything, one of the main things that was keeping cannabis companies from investing in, reform was that their balance sheets were too tight, right? Like, eliminating 280E benefits their cash flow position, and hopefully some of that will be invested in government relations to push for reform.
Yeah. And cannabis law firms, and also lobby of people who work in policy and cannabis consulting. Certainly, I mean, right? Well, Andrew, like always, this has been great and very informative.
Thanks, man.
For everybody who is kind of asking themselves, what does this all mean and what is it all about? Because certainly we've all been talking about it in the industry, but I've heard people just who don't work in cannabis saying, "Hey, there was something last week. What is that?
Yeah, I've got lots of questions here. It's always fun to be like, this is actually a big deal, but doesn't affect this or that. Or
it's a big deal, but don't drive in your car with that. Yeah, more or less. So anybody watching, if you want to, reach out to Andrew or see what he's working on, you can go check out Vicente LLP website. They have a lot of really interesting insights, blog posts, and webinars about the industry and all these sorts of issues with what's happening, not just with Schedule 3, but all types of stuff in cannabis on the state level, regulatory level, all types of stuff. In terms of us, if you want to come check out what we're doing at Rootwurks, what we do for cannabis education, training, and compliance, learn more about the Rootwurks learning experience platform. That's our flagship platform for cannabis training and compliance management. So come check us out. And here's how you can reach out. And thanks for being with us. And we'll see you at the next one. Thanks, Andrew.